Wow.
Tusker.
Beautiful. There is a lone elephant. Beautiful big elephant. Wow. Where is my camera when I need it? This is Crowd Science from the BBC World Service. I'm Marnie Chesterton, and I'm in the back of a Land Cruiser driving on a dusty road through Amboseli National Park at the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro in southern Kenya. So there's a plain to our left and right, and on it thousands of animals. I've seen gnu, I've seen elephant, I've seen flamingos, I've seen zebra, but the animals are a bonus. They're not the reason we're here. We're here to try and answer a question from listener Jeff in Sydney in Australia.
Hello, Crowd Science. Increasingly, we've been hearing weather events described as climate events. But the weather is always changing, and I'm not totally convinced that heat waves in the UK or floods here in Australia are climate events at all. It's just weather, surely. So my question for Crowd Science is, when does weather change become climate change?
That is an interesting question, Jeff. I detect a level of scepticism. What makes you say that you're not convinced?
Because my background is as a journalist, and my training has always been to be sceptical.
Mm-hmm.
And to understand that while not everybody is telling an untruth, not everybody is telling the whole truth all the time, and that many experts over the years that I was a reporter were wrong.
And then more specifically drilling down into the weather v climate, you're saying that it's always been variable. So do you think it might be just more of the same?
Look, I'm not such a sceptic to say that I don't believe the climate is changing. But the climate is generally measured over decades and even hundreds of years. And I suppose my concern about all of this is that the word weather has now become interchangeable with climate.
OK, so we're going to unpack what constitutes weather, what constitutes climate, and whether the weather is being mislabelled.
Well, I think it's a very interesting exercise, and I wish you well doing it, and I'll be very interested to hear it.
Good morning.
Hey, good morning. Okay, we are good to go.
Thank you, Jeff. He mentioned the recent unprecedented heat waves in the UK and the floods in Australia, but it seems that there are places all over the world being hit by extreme weather events. Take East Africa, which is not getting the headlines it maybe should for the current drought, one of the worst in decades. Are these just cases of unfortunate weather? Or do scientists classify this as climate change? That's what I'll be finding out over the course of this show. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's rejoin the drive through the dusty plains of the national park to an isolated village. I'm here to meet some people at the sharp end of changing weather patterns. The villagers here, women brightly dressed in their traditional tribal beads and shuka blankets, give us a welcome like nothing I've seen before. There's singing, dancing and a lot of handshaking. These are Maasai tribeswomen, and for the Maasai, owning and herding cows is their way of life. For many generations they've been nomadic, moving their cattle around this part of Africa in search of the best pasture. These days that's a lot harder. Most of Kenya's land is owned by someone, and even the wildlife protection schemes have limited the areas the Maasai are allowed to graze.
So, hi everybody, thank you so much, that was so beautiful, that was really so special. My name is Marnie, and I'm here because I want to find out how you live and how that's been affected as a result of the climate, the weather.
These Maasai women have been given cameras. It's part of an initiative to get them to document how they're affected by climate change. I guess you could call it diversification. Cow herders turn photographers because raising cows is getting harder. Their village has a semi-permanent feel. It's a circle of huts with walls made of cow dung in the middle of a scrubland of thorn trees and dust, which I cannot see being able to support any grazing animal. But what do I know? I sat down with a couple of the women, including Esther, who grew up here.
So, Esther, where we're sat is under a thorny tree to give us some shade from the sun. And there's about 3 centimetres of just like dust under our feet. And that's all I can see as in every direction. There's trees, there's thorny shrubs, and then there's dust. Is this normal?
Not normal. Not normal at all. When the rain comes, you will think you have been to a different place. Even if you sit under this tree, the same tree, you will surely try to think you have never been here. Because it will be a very beautiful place. It will be green everywhere. It will be so bushy around here. And life will be so nice compared to now.
The other woman sitting with us is Mama Esther, the village elder. She admits to being 32 with a coy grin. The younger Esther, who's translating for us, says she's probably in her 80s, which means she's got quite a memory of the weather and climate of the past.
Tell me about the drought. When did the drought start?
Since last year, they have 3 years without good rain.
And can you tell me what the weather's like normally, like not in a drought year?
Before, she said everything was good because the rain was not taking time. A lot have changed because there before, when the droughts come, even if you have 200 cows, they will all die. When you see an animal who is dead because of drought, you feel so bad because they are very helpful to us. The weather and everything has changed. There before, rainfall pattern was different from now. Nowadays, the rain takes so long and it's not predictable. And every season comes with different diseases and different things, strange things. Since she's born, she never saw a season which is worse than this one because most wildlife have died this time. This drought is different from other droughts they ever came across.
Esther, how is the drought today different from dry seasons when you were little?
When I was little, drought was just for some few known months, so people could manage. And now it's not predictable at all because you can expect rain in a certain month and maybe it can rain, but a short rain that is not productive. And also, when I was young, our dads used to have so many animals, so many cows, and during drought they become thin, but not that worse that they die. Nowadays, if you see a drought, you get somebody who lost just 50 cows because of drought.
Is it much more difficult to find pasture?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because the rain did not rain, so there were no enough grass in the bush. They have nowhere to go find those grass. And also, the animals are being fed by these animal feeds.
So that costs money?
Yes, and they use the money they get from selling the animals. And the animals are now thin and they cannot sell anymore. So it is very hard.
So that sounds like a sort of downward spiral because you can't sell the animals to buy the grain to feed the animals because you've sold the animals. And then you're not getting a good price for the animals because they're too skinny.
Yes, because it was easier to sell 2 cows to feed 100 cows. But now, to get that amount of feeds to feed the 100 cows, you'll have to sell 50 cows.
Oh, wow.
Because of the bad market.
Wow, okay.
They are thin, so they don't go good prices. And the things have gone so high prices in the market. So everything is difficult,
So it sounds like life is getting tougher.
so tough.
The Maasai have been herding their cattle across these lands for generations, and not one person we spoke to can remember a drought as bad as this one. Yes, it's East Africa, and you might expect it to be very dry out here. It's a part of the world where the seasons split into rainy and dry, and traditionally, Maasai have managed to find enough to feed their cattle during the driest bits between one rainy season and the next. As year after year the rains come later and last for fewer days, the cows and the people are malnourished. But why so many failed rainy seasons in a row? Is it just weather, as our listener Jeff suggests? Or is there something else going on? What we need is an expert on the weather in this part of the world.
Hi, my name is Patricia Nyinguro. I am a climate scientist. I work at the Kenya Meteorological Department in Nairobi, and we are at the headquarters right now.
Okay, so we're round the back of the building, and I've literally just turned around and actually clocked that all of these things that I thought were pylons behind me, they're weather monitoring systems?
Yes, so right there is the weather station, observation station. So we have all the thermometers and rain gauges and all, but these ones are also transmission. So we get data from across the country. So some of these masts are communication ones.
Okay, so that satellite will be pinging you information about temperature and humidity patterns
from other parts of the country. Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So can you talk a bit about the climate of East Africa historically?
Yes, so over the years, it has always been very predictable. Most farmers would tell you, because we depend on rainfall for agriculture. Most farmers would tell you 15th of March it would start raining, and 15th of October or that week it would start raining as the beginning of the season. And this has been the norm for many, many years. But now, in more recent years, we're seeing that has really changed. So we have seasons where the rainfall comes in earlier, and we have seasons where the rainfall really delays. And for us, that's a clear indication of changing climate.
Okay, so can you help our listeners to understand the difference between changes in weather and climate change?
Mm-hmm. So climate change would be a change in the long-term average of what we know or what we see from records about the climate of a region. So, for example, if Nairobi receives maybe 700 millimeters of rainfall per year on average, so climate change would be if it receives more. So if consistently over an average receives maybe 1,000 or receives 200, so that would be climate change.
So how many years does it need to keep happening before you can put your finger on it and go, yes, definitely climate change?
So average of 30 years minimum would characterize climate.
So if we're going back to changes that happened in 1990, we are just coming up to a point where scientists can say, yes, this is definitely climate change.
Yes, and the advantage that we have now with advancement in technology and all that is that models can be able to give you data far back and even into the future. So even if you have not enough data, with model simulations you can be able to get an indication of what the weather or the climate is like, and therefore see whether it has changed or not.
So does all of that mean that the weather has become more difficult to forecast in parts of Kenya?
It's more challenging because the systems that we have always relied on to aid us in doing the predictions are also being impacted by climate change. A good example is the sea surface temperatures. As the atmosphere warms, then the sea surface temperatures also rise, and therefore we are seeing different impacts or different reactions of the Kenyan weather to these changes that we're seeing.
So a slight difference in temperature might tip a system one way rather than the other.
We talk about tipping points.
Yeah.
And this is exactly what tipping points are.
So with the global differences in temperature that are causing climate change, we're not talking about big differences. We're talking about 1, 2, 3 degrees, which if you're talking about the differences in weather between day and night, that's easily 10, 15, 20 degrees. So why is an average increase in temperature causing such a big impact?
So the global average, of which we are just above 1.1 degrees Celsius relative to the pre-industrial times, is really important because it aggregates the really big jumps in temperatures. And so that's very important when we're talking about climate change, because such a small change on the global level could result in really big changes in other systems. So beyond a certain temperature rise, the glaciers could completely melt. And because that is an irreversible change, we would never have those back. So that would lead to many other issues coming up, such as the drivers of our weather being impacted, which would lead to more extreme weather events and more frequent extreme of these events. So the global average really is important because it aggregates all the changes that we're seeing across the globe with tremendous impacts on local scale systems.
Can I ask about the women in Amboseli? Why have their rainy seasons failed so many times?
Well, they are in a relatively drier part of Kenya that is arid, semi-arid, and regular or typical rainfall over that region, even for the entire year, is not very high. But now enter climate change, and we've seen, particularly in the last few years, the whole of Kenya has received really depressed rainfall. And because they're already in an area that receives little rainfall, they are also more impacted by that reduction in rainfall.
Is this going to be an ongoing trend for them? I mean, do you expect the rains to return for them at some point?
Well, the intense variability is definitely expected to continue now that we are dealing with climate change. They will have rainfall as the systems continue to change, but maybe not as good as they used to have it. And we can only tell this as we go closer to a season and prepare our seasonal forecasts here. But the variability where we're seeing heavier rainfall over some seasons and really depressed over other seasons has really taken a hold, and we're seeing this throughout most parts of Kenya.
According to Patricia, the difference between climate and weather is time. Weather is what you'll feel on your face if you stick your head out of the window. Climate is the average, what you'd expect to feel in, say, early November, given what's happened over previous years. The two things are obviously linked, and not only is climate change directly affecting the Maasai, it's also messing with Patricia's forecasting models. You're listening to Crowd Science from the BBC World Service, and we're in Kenya trying to untangle the differences between changes in the weather and climate change for our listener Jeff in Sydney, Australia. Now, Jeff was also concerned that scientists are basing their climate predictions on data from the last couple of decades. He wasn't sure that was long enough. To try and get an answer to that, we're travelling to Ngong, a town just outside Kenya's capital. It's home to a smart new science hub called ICPAC, a climate prediction and application centre funded by 8 countries around the Horn of Africa which are facing similar changes to their weather patterns.
Hi, good morning. Good, thank you.
My name is Abebe Tadege. I'm the climate change officer at ICPAC.
And we're in the shade, and that noise in the background is the wind whistling through the flagpoles. So when climate changes, hasn't climate always changed?
Yeah, it has. In fact, over millions of years, the climate changes. We can recall, for example, the Ice Age, where the global temperature or the global climate was very cold. There are also warm periods in the past. But when we talk about climate change these days, in most cases, we are referring about the human-induced, human-caused climate change because of our activities, human activities, especially the burning of fossil fuels, deforestation, industrial process, and so on. And it is happening very rapidly in 100 years, 50 years, 10 years. In fact, I carried my laptop to show you those trends.
Oh, go on then.
So you can see that the trend is very clear, the temperature trend.
Okay, so you have these sort of decades where it's a bit colder, a
and
bit
warmer,
a bit
colder, but now...
And then suddenly there's this big
increase in block, yeah.
And it's much higher.
Higher, yes. So obviously temperature has increased without any mistake.
Okay.
If you take all stations from the region and make analysis, the temperature has increased. Maybe in the past 60, 70 years, about 2 degrees centigrade. compared to the average.
So your particular project looks at drought. How has that changed?
So drought over the years, especially in this part of Africa, is intensifying in terms of frequency, also in magnitude. We are going to have 5 consecutive failed rainy seasons in this part of Africa. So this has never been the case in the past.
Never ever?
Yes.
This is unprecedented.
This is unprecedented.
How long do your records go back, though?
Well, our data sets, in most cases, in our archive, starts from the 1960s. That means we have a record of like 60 years.
In the grand scheme of things, since the 1960s, since the 1950s, the last 100 years of measurements, isn't that long a time to have been measuring? So how sure can you be that 200 or 300 years ago this sort of thing wasn't happening?
Well, if you have heard about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's called IPCC, and it is a recent report which was released in 2021, even 2022. It has conclusively concluded that the observed trend is human-caused. This is almost 100%. The previous reports were doubting. There were some uncertainties.
I think it's worth stopping here for a moment to remind you that scientists' default setting is to work out degrees of uncertainty. That first IPCC report Abebe mentions came out in 1990, and at that point there were many uncertainties and a certain amount of disagreement about what was happening. But 32 years later, that has changed.
The first report, there were still some doubts because of maybe data and more research. But over the years, now the sixth assessment report, which has gathered more input in terms of data, in terms of modeling, and so on, it has improved a lot, and the certainty has increased. In fact, they are saying climate change is unequivocally caused by humans, and it's unequivocally happening. There's no doubt.
No doubt is an incredibly strong thing to hear a scientist say. But then the IPCC reports aren't just your average science research. They're summaries of mountains of evidence which refines and shores up the initial findings. Human activities have caused the climate to change, and with a speed not seen over previous natural cycles of warming and cooling. The experts we've spoken to so far are absolutely certain about it. Which isn't quite enough for listener Jeff, who points to the times in the past when experts have just got things wrong. How can we be sure that what we've been hearing isn't just a lot of doom-mongering?
Hi Marnie, welcome to UCL.
Back in London now, I've come to meet someone who might be able to help us with that.
I'm Mark Masson and I am an Earth System Scientist here at University College London. And I'm sure you're going to say, what is an Earth System Scientist? Well, I study climate change in the past, the present and the future.
Mark has been one of the expert reviewers on the IPCC report, so he's in a pretty good position to be able to explain how it works.
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, these are huge tomes, but they are separated into chapters. And those chapters are agreed by all the countries of the UN. Each chapter has a developed and developing country lead author, so there can be no accusation of green colonialism or it's just the West trying to impose science on the rest of the world. The leaders in their scientific field or their social science field or economics come together and they write the chapters. These chapters then are commented on by reviewers around the world. So we're talking thousands of people now are involved in each report. And each country has their experts and their policymakers pore over it, and they can ask questions and suggest corrections to every chapter. But the one document which is really important in each report is the executive summary. The executive summary, or the executive summary for policymakers, is a distillation of all of the report put together and agreed word by word by 196 countries. So when climate deniers go, the scientists are just making it up, many people don't agree, politicians don't agree, well, actually, the 2021 report, the 2022 reports from the IPCC have an executive summary which has been signed off and agreed by every single country in the UN. So not only is the science being distilled down, but policymakers and politicians are going, yeah, actually, this is the best of the best science, and actually it's right.
Mark was keen to stress that the science around global warming really isn't that new.
This is a subject that is 150 years old. Eunice Foote clearly demonstrated 150 years ago the greenhouse effect. How? Well, all of you can do it. You put CO2 into a test tube, you put air in a test tube, put thermometers in, seal it up, just put it in the sunlight, and then record like every good scientist. And guess what? The one with CO2, the temperature warms up quicker, gets to a higher temperature, stays warmer for longer, and eventually cools off and gets to the same temperature as your air. Guess what? The greenhouse effect was discovered.
We've heard from various sources whilst making this programme that a 30-year period is sufficient in deciding that climate change is a thing. But Jeff's been around a lot longer than that, and he thinks that maybe the data that we're using for climate predictions, it's just too short a time frame. Is there a danger in this context of relying on the data we have when meteorological data is limited to the decades that we've been collecting it?
If we step back, one, we have over 150 years of data in lots of key locations. We have hordes of scientists who are digitizing all the incredible climate data that we have recorded during the Victorian period all the way up to the present day. So we have humongous amounts of data. We also then can go further back. I trained as a paleoclimatologist. We can use tree rings, caves, ice cores. We can go much further back. And one of the most interesting things that we test our models against is the last ice age. So if we go back 18,000 years ago, there was an ice sheet over North America, 3 kilometers thick over Chicago. There was an ice sheet 2 kilometers thick over Scotland and Scandinavia. And that was a huge climate change. The actual temperature of the Earth dropped by 5 degrees. But we can use all of that data to test our climate models against and see how well they do and actually calibrate them to make sure that actually we know how things change. And one of the most interesting things is, of course, CO2, methane dropped markedly during the Ice Age, which also added to how cold it was. But think about that. That's the last Ice Age. Sea levels dropped by 120 meters, and that was only 5-degree cooling. We're talking about perhaps having a 3 to 5 degrees warming in the future if we do not deal with climate change. So actually, the further we go back, the more data we collect, the more worried we are about the future. So the science is incredibly long, incredibly detailed, and actually climate change is the most tested theory and idea in the history of humanity. Our science is the best of the best of the best.
Thanks to Mark Maslin, who, like all of our climate scientists, is confident in the science. Jeff wanted to know how sure scientists are that stuff labelled climate change isn't just the variable weather we've always had, but put in a context which is frankly less familiar and more terrifying. We've learnt that while weather is what we experience day to day, climate is the average of that, the long-term trends. Your local climate is changing, whether you live in Australia, Kenya or the South Pole, and it's changing because we humans have put large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The science on this is incredibly robust, tested and reviewed by thousands of scientists, and even officially agreed upon by every UN member state through the IPCC report. There's even an emerging field of research, attribution science, which takes individual weather events, like a flood or a drought, and looks at the likelihood of it being the result of climate change or it just being weather. does it matter, some will ask? Because if you're dealing with the catastrophic consequences of wildfires in California, floods in Pakistan and Australia, or not enough rain like the Maasai women in Kenya, the origin story of the extreme event is not exactly top of your priority list. But I'd argue that knowing the part our species played in causing the problem is useful for many reasons. One is that weather can seem so much bigger than us, ungovernable. But knowing that humans have changed the climate means that we can do something about fixing the mess. And the World Service has a whole show, The Climate Question, dedicated to the ways and whys of doing this. My thanks to Jeff for his question, and back to him for the credits.
You've been listening to Crowd Science from the BBC World Service. Today's question was from me, Jeff, in Sydney, Australia. It was presented by Marnie Chesterton, and it was produced by Ben Motley with Christine Johannes. If you've got a question that you'd like the Crowd Science team to try and answer, email crowdscience@bbc.co.uk. Thanks everybody for listening.
Now, that's not quite the end of the podcast. I want to say a big thank you to the Maasai community who shared their stories with us. Their nomadic existence is already put at risk by various pressures of modern living. It's clear that it won't take much more change to make their way of life completely untenable. Which would be a shame. The world would be poorer without their culture. And if you want to see some of the photographs taken by the women in Amboseli, there's a link in the episode description for this podcast. It feels right to give them the last word. Climate change is something the Maasai way of life and society hasn't caused, but they are feeling the consequences. It is very much their problem. So how do they feel about it?
When they knew about climate change, they all stood up and said, true, this is climate change. And it's something we have been going through, although we did not know what is happening. But now that we know, it just came to be familiar to them.
Are they angry? I'd be really annoyed if it was my life that was affected and I wasn't the person causing it.
Of course, it's not something to be happy about, but at least they know. They now know what is happening. So their life still will go on. Yes, they are not angry. They are trying to adapt.